Welcome to the final installment in the Helios home remodel series, where we get to the best part, turning what was a pretty bland environment without UVB into a more naturalistic jungle playground with UVB. If you didn't watch the first one, it's linked up there, but the long and short is that in order to transform Helios's environment the way I wanted to, I needed to put him in a temporary enclosure while I worked, and since that temporary enclosure was much smaller than what he was used to, I felt the pressure to get things done as quickly as possible, which proved to have its own set of challenges, of course. I forgot. I screwed this in from the bottom. Are you happy with yourself? No. So if you're ready to see how I went from the old to the new, stick around and let's slither on into it. Unfortunately, I was sick almost the entire time I worked on this project. So between that and the fact that things always take longer than you think they will, it ended up being about a 3-week process to get this finished. The goal was to install his new UVB and to give him more comfortable basking places underneath it and his various other heating elements. I had pre-made some of the components, some faux rock shelves and some PVC branches, but it wasn't quite as simple as just screwing them in and calling it good. Probably because I'm a perfectionist. But I actually hated how the shelves turned out at first, and they weren't quite as easy to install as I had hoped, but the method I used to create them did work and has the potential to be helpful to anyone who might want to make shelves that don't require a full background build out in an enclosure. I had shaped and painted some PVC pipe for branches, and if you want to know how to do that, there's a video up there about it. But I wanted to do something I hadn't done with them before, which was to join them together and span them across the enclosure in a way that was sturdy enough for a pretty big and extremely strong arboreal snake to climb on while looking as natural as possible. It turned out to be impossible for me to get them cut, joined, and arranged in the way I wanted to while they were outside of the enclosure. And on top of that, I had some serious apprehension about how it all was going to look without a background. So as I worked, coughed my lungs out, and waited for things to cure, I investigated some alternatives that wouldn't involve a bunch of foam carving that would keep Helios stuck in his tiny apartment for way longer than necessary. Sometimes hardship actually spurs ingenuity, so even though I had no idea what I was doing and had some unfortunate hiccups and do-overs along the way, I managed to pull off something that I feel pretty good about in the end. So although sickness kept me from filming as much as I would have liked, hopefully what you see from my process will give you some ideas if you ever want to take a boring enclosure to the next level without having to go to the lengths of extensive background building. And if you enjoy the video, please take a moment to make sure you're subscribed and give it a like before you go, and comment below if you have questions or are inspired to share. My patrons got some sneak peeks of this while I was working on it, so if you want to get some extra content, completely ad-free episodes, and you want to help support the channel, please go over to Patreon and become a member. We're also doing monthly Zoom calls now, and it's such a great way to connect more deeply with each other and get support in taking the best care of our scaly friends that we possibly can. Thank you to all my current patrons. You keep me going. All right. Let's get to building. So now I have 2 shelves to put up. One's going here, and then the other one is here. These are made of polystyrene and Drylock and some great stuff, and also some epoxy clay. And then I used shelf brackets, just regular old shelf brackets, and I built them into them. So then I pre-installed the screws because it's really hard to get to them from the outside. And I'm going to put silicone caulk for an extra bit of grip because there's not a lot that these screws can do. I'm not going to rely only on these screws. I'm going to put this one here, and that way he also can bask at a lower point, and one of the branches could even go in between. This way he'll have different ways to utilize and get that good stuff from the UVB. I really hope this works out. I thought I was being smart by pre-installing the screws in the shelves, and I'll spare you from watching it, they still were extremely difficult to get to with my gun, so it took much cursing and many tries to get them to work. The reason I had the third shelf bracket separated from the shelf is because I knew that the shelves weren't going to fit perfectly square in the enclosure corners. And this allowed me some leeway to attach the final bracket so it would be sturdy and as snug to the sidewalls as possible. I didn't feel great about how they looked. With all the holes in the walls and the different color back and sides, I felt pretty bummed about it. But there was nothing to do but just keep pushing ahead. I hoped I'd have some genius idea on how to fix that while I worked on the branches. So this is the tricky part, figuring out how to cut the ends of my perches and place them before I use the epoxy to join them and then paint them and stuff. So at the moment, I've got this big one kind of in the place that I want it, sort of. I just put a little hot glue just to temporarily hold it in place, just so I can figure out the way that the other ones are gonna go. It's very tricky, and I don't know if I'm doing it as I should, but I'm giving it a try, so we'll see where it goes. And it's still tricky, but I think things will stay long enough for me to get the epoxy clay going and maybe some glue first. I don't know, because hot glue definitely doesn't last. I'm also thinking I want one more that way there, and I have one more to use. But I'm feeling sick, so I might call it for the day and tack it tomorrow. I ended up using a combination of screws, glue, and spray foam for the initial attachments before I moved on to the epoxy clay, just to ensure they'd hold up to Helios's weight and strength. Cutting the PVC to perfect compound angles proved pretty impossible, so I figured the more reinforcement, the better. I do plan on using Zoopoxy on my next full build, but someone recommended a similar product that I thought I'd try, called Epoxy Sculpt, and I was able to buy a smaller amount off Amazon for less expense than Zoopoxy for this build. Epoxy is also an epoxy clay, but it doesn't need the thickening compound that Zoopoxy does. Honestly, being sick meant that any step I could remove from the process was a win. Part A and Part B need to be mixed together in equal parts. So first you make balls of each part and make sure they are as close to the same size as possible. Then you spend about 2 to 3 minutes mixing them together. They must be completely mixed in order to work. So you can start by folding them into each other, and then I found that rolling it in between my hands was the best way to really get the two parts fully blended. I kind of had flashbacks to making snakes out of clay when I was a kid. You have about an hour of working time with this stuff before it hardens. So I applied it to the joints of the branches and then began to shape it so that it smoothed out the seam between the two pieces. It's good to have a cup of water nearby, dipping your fingers in it while you're molding it so that your fingers don't get sticky as you go. Since there was already texture in the PVC, I wanted to make a continuation of that into these epoxy clay joints that I was making. I found it was best to wait until the clay had started hardening a little bit before I used tools on it, because once it was firmer, it was easier to shape the details. Honestly, I was just making this up as I went, and crossing my fingers, it ended up looking okay.
So now that the epoxy is hardened, I'm being lazy and I'm not going too crazy with the texture or anything, but I've got to paint it to match this as much as I can. I should have cleaned off the water from the epoxy clay while I was doing it, and I didn't, and so now it's like basically on there for good. I have to paint over it. I have the colors that I used saved up. These are the colors I used for the branches originally, so hopefully I can feather it out and make it look nice, and we'll see how it goes.
I actually didn't have all of the same colors I used originally, so I had to mix on the fly, and once again, cross my fingers. While the paint was wet, it definitely wasn't looking good. I did 3 different colors, feathering them out so I could cover the residue from the clay water. The last color was the darkest, and I put a heavy layer on to get into the grooves and then wiped off excess with a cloth. Once that was dry, it definitely looked a lot better, so it was time for the final step. Eco-Poly not only seals in the paint, but it makes moisture bead up and makes cleaning really easy. If you watched part 1 of the series, you know that Dominican red mountain boas have some seriously hard to clean urates, and my hope was that this stuff would make my life a lot better when it came time to remove them. So I applied a couple of heavy coats of this with a sponge brush, making sure it got into all the grooves. It does look glossy when it's wet, but it dries matte, and once it did, the transitions looked pretty much seamless. I needed to open up one of the vents in the wall to bring in the cables that would connect to the UVB and the LEDs. The vents in this enclosure were already pretty wide, so I just used a 1/2-inch drill bit to open one of them up enough to get the cables through. The thermostat probes could just slip right through the vents, and I labeled them so I could make sure to put the correct one under the 2 different heat bulbs, a deep heat projector and a ceramic heat emitter, both set to slightly different temperatures and one of them going off at night. Then I used cable traps to hold them in place. Remember how I was bummed about the background looking ugly? Well, while I was sick and waiting for things to dry and cure, I went online looking for ideas, thinking maybe I'd just buy a photography backdrop that looked like a forest or a jungle and attach it to the walls. But that would have been best done before I put in the shelves and the branches, because at this point I'd have to cut the pieces to fit around everything, and that thought just made me tired. Then I stumbled on these artificial grass wall panels. They're meant to cover fencing and have rigid plastic backs that hold the greenery in place. Since they were larger than I needed, that backing made it easy to cut them into smaller sections that I could simply screw into the walls of the enclosure. They covered surface area so quickly and absolutely transformed the way everything looked. Really, this was an aesthetic choice that wasn't exactly of benefit to Helios. However, I realized that if I ever needed an extra boost of humidity, spraying the panels with water could actually be useful because the droplets would have so many places to sit on and evaporate over time to increase the humidity inside. So in the end, they weren't just pretty, they have function for him as well. Honestly, I was just so relieved I wouldn't have to look at those ugly walls anymore, and I felt like the greenery even made the shelves and the branches look better too. I also wanted to add some extra plants in the front to create visual barriers to increase Helios' sense of security. I ended up using way less than what I originally had in there before because with the branches crisscrossing everywhere, I felt like he'd feel pretty secure. I also found this cool little wall-hanging water planter that I could put pothos cuttings in, and another wall-hanging planter from Monstera for the other wall. So there'd be some real plants for barriers as well, and the LED grow lights would help them thrive. I have finished Helios' upgrade. I am so excited. It's the day today to put him in. I have been checking the temperatures for the last at least 24 hours, and they're great. Obviously, they're changed right now but I wanted to show you a few changes I made while I was finishing everything. I've been sick for weeks, so I wasn't always able to stay on camera or keep up with things on camera very well, but I completely altered the angle of the UVB, and I think it's way better now than just kind of straight across because he's got a lot of area. He can bask here, he can bask here, he can bask down here at multiple different levels. And the halogen is on the inside now. Because of the angle I made for the UVB, it had to cross the hole for the halogen that had originally been cut there. I changed it up a couple times. I put it on dimmer. So I played around with it and made sure that the temperature didn't get too hot in here. 75 watt was actually too much. So dialing it down was great. Played with that for a while and all the temperatures look perfect. I still need to put in his hides. I'm not really sure how they're going to fit right now because he's been using them. So this is the exciting part, is to get this final last bits and bobs placed and see how he uses it for a few days. And if I need to change anything, I can, move around hides or add more or whatever I need to do. This is all yours. This whole thing. This was the moment I'd been looking forward to for a long time. Not just for the weeks I'd worked on this, but I'd struggled and racked my brain for the best way to do all of this for months before I started. So watching him explore, seeing him have more opportunities to climb, and finally giving him the benefits of UVB, it was just so rewarding. And that's the thing. Snake therapy isn't just about getting comfort from keeping and interacting with snakes, but also about giving to them and offering them the best lives we possibly can. Caretaking is absolutely therapeutic. Even after all of this work, I do plan on giving Helios a larger enclosure someday. He's 5 now, so he's probably not going to grow too much more. But as you can see, he is big enough that he'd definitely benefit from more space. For now though, at least the space he does have is utilized as much as possible and offers him the choice to act out various natural behaviors and get the healthy benefits from UVB and some fun enrichment. And his behavior so far shows me that he feels safe and content with it. Let me know what you think of it or throw questions down in the comments, and please hit that like button before you go. And in case you didn't know, we have an amazing Discord server if you want to be part of the snake therapy community. It's a joyful, safe space for people to share their love for their animals, get support, and make new friends. I hope to see you there. I'm Shira, and this is Helios, the Dominican red mountain boa, and we'll see you again next time for more snake therapy.